Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Sviat Hnizdovskyi, who is the CEO and founder of OpenMinds, a cognitive defense tech company countering authoritarian influence in the battle for free and open societies. Sviat Hnizdovskyi, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you, John. Thank you for the invitation.
So the conversation I'd like to have with you today, Sviat, will cover the work that you and your team are doing at OpenMinds. But before we get into this topic, could we please start by getting your assessment of our strategic landscape, or if you prefer, the times in which we live?
Oh, what a broad question to start with. But let's try to attempt given an answer. So, John, we are talking today about propaganda and disinformation, right? And I think the first statement I would like to make is that might be not really pleasant to many people, but I honestly deeply believe that propaganda and disinformation, they are not the problems of information. They are the problems of meaning. And by that, I mean that we tend to focus too much on the properties of these phenomena that are, related to the information itself, to the bytes of information, like whether it's factual and represents reality or not, whether it's fake or not, whether it's distorted by, a malign actor. And probably 99% of efforts, programs, budgets, and discussions are happening within that framework. But I would really love to challenge this sort of thinking and suggest that we should probably start speaking and thinking about propaganda as the problem of meaning, in a way that we are living through the meaning crisis currently. We are living in the times where the typical traditional institutions of meaning are not really present there anymore, or we lost our trust in them as a society. I could just give you probably a brief overview, but obviously we had religious institutions, we have ideologies in the 20th century when we decided we can't rely on religious institutions anymore in the age of secularism. But then the collapse of Soviet Union, and before that collapse of the Nazi Germany, and sort of post-colonial criticism and postmodernism led us to the world where we don't even really believe in ideologies anymore. And one of the most successful ideology would be American dream and consumerism. That is still present up to this date, but faces a lot of criticism. And in my view, we are sort of having this huge gap of meaning. The need for that is still existing, right? So people still need that, but there are no means how they could satisfy this urge and this very basic need. And here comes propaganda. And propaganda is the way to construct the new reality and potentially fill these gaps and do that in a very fundamentally meaningful manner as well. And it's not just about someone who pushes and imposes propaganda on people like, malign actor or countries like Russia, but it's also a lot of pulling from people to actually wanting to have some sort of narrative in their life to give them purpose, to understand their place there. And that's basically how I'm perceiving this problem now.
Yeah, wow, boy, you said a lot there. I one of the things I heard you mention is I don't know, maybe just the general deterioration of institutions in the West, perhaps in particular, and for democracies. One of our previous podcast guests, I'll put a link in the show notes, but a gentleman named Jonathan Rausch, he wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Constitution of Knowledge, uh, where he describes a informal apparatus of uh, evaluating information, or how the constitutions that undergird our societies have a very important purpose of being able to filter information and ultimately pass through information which is true, or more likely to be true for consumption by follow-on individuals. But our institutions are changing and failing to provide that kind of a filtering mechanism in the way that they did, say, maybe 20 or 40 or more years ago. And the evaluation of truth, has never been a clean process. It's always been a messy process, but today it seems like it is an especially messy process. And as you were describing, Sviat, a very worrisome thing. And perhaps this is, I don't know, maybe a explicit goal of the uh, uh, organizations and governments, Russia, for example, and promulgating so much false and mis and disinformation. Perhaps that's one of the goals, is to actually deteriorate further the institutions that we have relied upon in the past. What are your thoughts about all of that?
Well, thank you, John. I think you brought up just a few very important topics here, which I would love to dive into. So
Yeah.
first, you mentioned this distinction with between information and knowledge, referring to the book. And
Yes.
there is an example I have in my mind where I would like to reference my dear friend and colleague, Dr. John Barbaika from the University of Toronto. He always gives this example when he speaks about information and knowledge. So he asks his students the question, where do you go to get information? And the answer is usually, oh, I'll use internet, Wikipedia, rather, like now ChatGPT probably. Then he would ask a question, where would you go to get knowledge? And then he would usually see much less certain answers, like, people are having trouble actually saying where they would go for knowledge, but probably they would say like maybe library, or university, or some circle of people who have some experience. But then he asked the question, where would you go for wisdom? And then there is a real silence in the room. And I would love to connect the concept of wisdom with the concept of meaning we talked earlier about, because wisdom was always the cultivation of wisdom was basically the process how people acquired and cultivated meaning in their life, partially as well, going all the way from the ages of Socrates and the philosophies of the ancient Greece and Rome, and up to the very present times. We had these institutions of wisdom, whether they were religious or philosophical, or potentially just groups of people that gathered in a place to discuss ideas and think deeply about the nature of reality. And their place in this reality. But it looks like with the different sort of incentives, which we could, of course, discuss later on, we lost these institutions of wisdom. And let's take a look at the country like Russia. So the religious institution they had, because I would use probably past tense here, just transformed into the arm of the intelligence services, and it's not serving the initial purpose anymore, probably, or pretending to serve it, and it's not serving the real purpose behind. So that would be the distinction and the root of the problem I see, again, around propaganda and disinformation. But the other thing you mentioned, which I'd like to really highlight that, is the notion of truth.
Yeah.
Like, how do we know what's truthful now in this age of having too much noise and not that much signal potentially? And I'd really love to distinguish the concept of truth and concept of truthful. So truthful would be something that I personally have a conviction and belief is true, whereas true would be something that, let's say, it's very complex epistemological philosophical question, but
yes.
truth would be something that represents the objective reality in the best way possible. Yeah, and we can't really know what's true, but
it's an ideal.
Yeah, but we at least have our own understanding of what's truthful to us and what do we believe to be true, and the majority of information we tend to share on social media, to talk about, to have arguments about, lies within this domain of truthful information. And I honestly believe majority of people don't have any intent of leading someone close, their friends and followers on social media accounts astray from the truth. But that's the vision of truth and beliefs about truth they have in their lives. And the second layer of problem is that social media algorithm wouldn't really promote or highlight the truthful information that is just sort of something normal in the society, something that wouldn't really feel odd or contrarian. And what you have as a result is the design of social media, where you just have very polarized opinions, where it looks like everyone is even more polarized than people are in reality. There was beautiful research done in Ukraine recently, for example, measuring the polarization. And the perceived polarization by society was way higher than the real one. Basically, people believe that everyone is very much heated and aggressive and polarized, whereas in reality it wasn't the case. And then we have some evidence. I really love this study where people measured how long does the Thanksgiving evening last for families, and found an interesting correlation that the more people spend time on social media in the year before, like on average, the less time they wanted to spend with each other during the Thanksgiving supper.
Is that right? Wow. Might you be able to dig up that study so that we can put a link to it in the discussion notes?
Sure.
That would be great. Yeah, it's very the phenomenon has all kinds of follow-on effects for families and societies and the way we engage with one another, effects that we're only now coming to understand better, like you were just describing, for example. That is amazing. When did you start OpenMinds?
So we started working a couple of weeks before the full-scale invasion, but initially we actually started as just volunteering organizations. We didn't have any budgets. It was just a group of people who were really driven by the mission and the complexity of problem. But later, I think April or May 2022, we managed to find resources, find institutional partners, get on some contracts, and properly kick off as a team and organization.
Okay, great. What data do you tend to use in your analyses, and what are some of the data products that you guys produce?
So we use the approach that's called the triangulation of data.
Hmm.
So we rarely rely on one single source of data, but would rather, for example, use social media data, opinion poll data, and some qualitative information like focus groups or interviews, and try to find convergence between them. Because the complexity that we have is studying hard to reach audiences in regions like front lines of Ukraine, occupied territories of Ukraine, or other places, actually bears with it many obstacles, and we can't really have a very precise picture of realities. So we have to rely on many data streams and many types of data, even methodologies, to make sense of what's going on there. But I'd like to give probably an example that surprised me early on in 2022.
Yeah, please do.
So we did a sort of randomized control trial, or some people call it A/B test, where we basically would conduct an experiment with the control group and have a couple of experimental groups of participants, and present them with a particular narrative related to the Russia-Ukrainian war, and then later measure how this narrative impacts the support of the war, potentially social media behavior, and other metrics as well. And I was personally, and I would say we were surprised by two things. So the first one is the result of this randomized controlled trial. So we tested, I think, more than 60 narratives, and only 3 of them were significantly, statistically significant when it came to the decreasing support of the war, let's say, on temporary occupied territories of Ukraine, or decreasing the trust in propaganda from Russia. But we couldn't really guess before what would be this narrative. And more so, we did what's called the wisdom of the crowds study, where we would ask a group of experts on Russia, some very famous intellectuals, professors, analysts, what would they predict would be these narratives. The biggest surprise was that the predictive power of this analytical team was not better than a toss of a coin, basically, and which made me think about complex regions and complex scenarios like war being extremely counterintuitive. Everything they knew about Russia and Russian society and sociology, and political landscape, it was relevant, but they still couldn't really predict much what would help people to trust less in the domestic propaganda sources. And that surprised me a lot, and that basically just revealed a big crisis of expertise many Western institutions have, and how many probably wrong decisions we made along the way as well. And OpenMinds is here to basically help reduce this bias and help make many things about hard to reach areas measurable and conceivable. Yeah.
Wow. And these are the kinds of things that your customers are asking for so that they can make better decisions on how to engage and what to do next in the information environment?
Yeah, so typically there are a couple of different use cases that our customers ask for. The most prevalent one is just about the research and understanding of the landscape or of the informational landscape or geographical kind of landscape limited to a specific territory, like what's just going on there, what people are talking about, what are their beliefs, what motivates them do certain things and don't do other things. So this is the most typical request we get. And again, we rely a lot on social media data, but we don't see that as the only solution. And many times social media data and all sorts of analysis using machine learning models led us astray. And we could see later that it wasn't the best method how to get information from there. So that's the first and probably biggest use case. The other use cases are sometimes related to what could be the intervention, a campaign or communication that would, for example, help people increase their resilience towards propaganda. And that's why we would do randomized controlled trials and other types of studies. So that's the second. And the third is when there was already an intervention in the past and someone wants to measure actually how did that affect a particular group of society, a particular audience. It's much harder to do that retrospectively, but there's still ways how we can measure and answer this big question, basically. How do I know that this particular campaign and all of the resources invested into that resulted in something that's not just views and likes and engagement, but something much more meaningful and profound as a metric?
I see. Wow. Yeah, no, I can really see how all of that is very much um, uh, in demand and helpful. What are some of the problems that you are like reaching for and trying to solve for your customers currently that you might not have a full solution yet, but these are the kinds of things that they're asking for and that you and your team are, working on trying to solve. Like for example, we've had several episodes talking about the challenge of assessments. How how well are our influence efforts being received by our target audiences? How do we measure that? Like that's something that I know that is a live active problem that a lot of people are trying to solve. Is that something that you guys are working on, for example? And is there anything else that is emerging that you guys are actively working on?
Definitely, John. Measurements of effectiveness or
Yeah.
assessments
Yep.
or basically that's the biggest problem in the industry. And I believe it's also the most neglected problem. I don't see
Mm.
many institutions and companies trying to focus on that problem. So there are many great initiatives doing the first layer of analysis and research or investigation, just measuring the landscape, measuring the narratives, measuring the sentiment, doing network analysis, identifying the ontology of basically influence operations. And that's all great. And we also do a lot of work like that. But I think the breakthrough when it comes to the cognitive defense capabilities for our democratic world lies within the understanding and measurements of effectiveness, but also measurements of harm when it comes from the malign actor. because we have so many influence operations and election interference every day that we can't really deal with all of them, and we don't quite have a good prioritization framework. So out of this, let's say 300 influence operations we could detect with our tools, and analytical teams in the last month, how do we know which we should focus on and how much harm they actually did? For example, how much they polarized our societies, how much they undermined the trust in our institutions. And we don't really have a framework for that. We don't really have good methodologies. And I think, and that's, again, the mission of OpenMinds, to gather people, experts, teams, data, and create a breakthrough in this very important domain.
So for example, figuring out, the information environment is vast. It's huge. So it would not be. It's an appropriate thing to actually say that the information environment is literally everything. Everything can be considered the information environment. So you and your colleagues are working to help your customers identify where do we prioritize our attention, where in the information environment, or strategic, tactical, left, right, where do we focus our efforts on what is happening, and where does it matter the most, for example.
Yeah, that would be a good description, I think. And I would really love to probably highlight again the root problem of that. I think we as a democratic world lagging 20, 30 years behind the authoritarian powers in the capabilities and methods and understandings of cognitive warfare. Basically, countries like Russia and China had the whole century to perfect and polish their tactics and methods of domestic propaganda, and starting from early 2000s at least, with the usage of internet and later social media and accessibility of that on mobile devices, were extremely successful in conducting all sorts of operations abroad. And we, by us I mean democratic world, lost this art of cognitive defense, but also cognitive warfare. I think the last great things we did were probably in the times of World War II. The most recent book of Peter Pomerantsev, How to Win in Information Warfare, highlights this story very, very well in a very good manner. But I think ever since then, probably we lost this art, we lost the tools and methods, we lost this transition of knowledge and wisdom again in this domain. And now we're in the position where we are much far behind, and we have to realize we are in the middle of arms race, and we're in the middle basically of the box match where we are acting as a boxer that is just trying to dodge the punches, but is never punching back. And that's a big problem. And I think if we are eager to support Ukraine with the missiles that are hitting Russian territory, I think we should also start thinking about the similar activities that should be done in the domain of informational warfare. Let's say, asking ourselves the question, how can we ensure that their population is not buying into the bullshit of the domestic propaganda, is not eager to actively get conscripted into the army, is trying to actually actively avoid the conscription, for example. So all of these questions that have huge impact on the war are being neglected. And I believe there should be someone that has to start thinking about these questions pretty much seriously.
Yeah, for sure. And as the war is actively ongoing, these are the kinds of propaganda messages that are being delivered into Ukraine, which are affecting recruiting efforts, affecting morale, and everything.
Yeah, so definitely Russia is already executing what I've just mentioned and what should be done against Russia. So they're doing that against Ukraine for sure, and in some cases very successfully. And to do that, basically to do this sort of communication campaigns, let's call them, I don't mean that we have to also cross any ethical boundaries. So we're not talking
Mhm.
about engaging ourselves in the act of disinformation or distorting reality. I mean, the country is so full of problems that just presenting people with existing investigations, with existing problems would mean a lot and would probably signal something that they are not getting from their official channels they're consuming.
Wow, that is quite a problem, and I'm so happy to know that people like you and your colleagues, Fiat, are working on it to counter it and ultimately have democracy prevail. And it's obviously a live problem that is not not theoretical, not hypothetical, but a very living, real problem for you and your countrymen. And we obviously wish you and your colleagues Godspeed as you continue working on the problem. Do you think we could transition, Sviat, to some of our typical closeout questions? We have a lot of students and researchers who listen to this podcast. You already mentioned a book, but or a we'll get to the book in just a moment. But could you perhaps offer some a fruitful research question that a student might examine if they want to investigate these problems more?
Oh, that's a fabulous question. And I think I have too many research questions we are
Yeah,
struggling with, and
yeah.
we would really appreciate some help. Let's start first with this big bucket of questions related to the measurements of the effectiveness of, or measurements of harm of communication campaigns.
Hmm.
The big question is, how can we build a method of understanding the causal link between engagement of the audience, attitude change, and behavior change? So we can now measure these three things separately. It's very hard to also measure the attribution of one into the other and this cascade, the funnel, basically, how they transition within this funnel. So that would be the one. The second one is probably related to what I started with. It's the question of meaning. How can we figure out what are these gaps of, let's say, more fundamental ontological questions people have in their lives related to the meaning, to again what they can rely on in terms of institutions. Let's say Russian population is extremely polarized, but also atomized first and foremost. And the big question is how to develop good measurement mechanisms and surveys, questions to capture this again. And what could be the proposal? What could be the alternative? If we believe that propaganda is the problem of meaning, and there is a proposal by the malign actor, what could be the alternative proposal? And I don't think we quite figured out yet how to do that.
For sure, for sure. Fantastic research agenda items. And lastly, what are a couple of good books that you could suggest for our audience? You already mentioned the book "How to Win an Information War," I think, by Peter Pomerestev. Are there any other readings that you would recommend?
Definitely. So if someone wants to probably explore more this avenue of propaganda, the problem of meaning, I would recommend the very recent book of John Vervaeke and Christopher Mastropietro called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. I think it's a fantastic book that gives a good understanding of the problem of meaning in our civilization. What are the roots of the problems? What are the potential solutions for the problem? I think to better understand what's going on currently in the last decades in our Western world, but also pretty much in authoritarian countries as well, the book by the same collective of authors called Zombies in the Western Culture. It's actually, a zombie is used as a metaphor, as someone who is sort of alive biologically, but dead spiritually and intellectually, who acts individually. So if you recall any zombie movies, this is just mindless walk without the purpose, isolated, right? So they are not cooperating as the being. So again, and that's something we see in our modern world. We see the epidemic of loneliness. We see the, again, atomization of society. We see increased suicide rates. Let's take, again, Russia as an example. Russia ranks, I probably would bet, top 10 in suicide rate, in alcoholism, and in probably drug abuse as well. I think as for alcoholism, it's actually number 3 or number 2 country. This book is, I think, a good invitation to explore the question of meaning and how many societies turned into zombie societies in the last decades.
Yeah, for sure. They're just, as the name zombie implies, just kind of like sleepwalking through life and being served information, but not having the agency or the will to act on it. It's like a kind of like a crisis of meaning as well. I would think is related.
Definitely agree, and I think you highlighted that very well, that it boils down to the question of agency as well. How can we cultivate the agency within ourselves, right? Are we acting as agents, or are we just following the imposed agenda? And sometimes these boundaries are very hard to distinguish. So fully agree here with you, John.
And with that, Sviat, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Pleasure is all mine, John.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.